The thundering of hooves echoed through the crisp New England air as Paul Revere's horse galloped desperately through the darkness of April 18th, 1775. Behind him, the fate of a revolution hung in the balance, and ahead lay sleeping villages that would soon awaken to gunfire that would echo across centuries. What began as a routine British military operation to seize colonial weapons would ignite a conflict that would birth a nation and forever alter the course of human history. The tension had been building for months in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. King George III's government had grown increasingly frustrated with colonial resistance to British authority, particularly following the Boston Tea Party of 1773. The Intolerable Acts, passed by Parliament in 1774, had only served to further inflame colonial sentiment against the Crown. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, found himself in an impossible position, tasked with maintaining order in a province that grew more rebellious by the day. Intelligence reports had reached Gage indicating that the colonial militia, known derisively by the British as rebels, were stockpiling weapons and ammunition in the town of Concord, some 18 miles northwest of Boston. These supplies represented more than mere military materiel. They symbolized colonial defiance and preparation for armed resistance. The decision to march on Concord was not made lightly, for Gage understood that such an action might provoke the very conflict he had been trying to avoid. On the evening of April 18th, approximately 700 British regulars from the Light Infantry and Grenadier Companies began their fateful march from Boston Common. Under the cover of darkness, they crossed the Charles River and began their advance toward Lexington and Concord. The soldiers, many of them veterans of European campaigns, moved with the confidence born of professional military training and the certainty that colonial militia could pose no serious threat to His Majesty's forces. However, the Sons of Liberty had established an intricate network of spies and informants throughout Boston, and news of the British movement spread quickly through the colonial intelligence network. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the leading patriots in Boston, dispatched multiple messengers to warn the countryside of the approaching danger. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott each took different routes to ensure that word would reach its destination, despite any British attempts at interception. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Paul Revere's Ride, the colonial warning system represented a sophisticated intelligence operation that would prove crucial in the coming engagement. Revere's famous Midnight Ride, immortalized in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, was but one part of a larger coordinated effort to mobilize the colonial militia. The British column, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn, pressed forward through the night, unaware that their mission had been compromised and that across the Massachusetts countryside, church bells were ringing and signal fires were being lit. In farmhouses and villages throughout the region, men were checking their muskets, gathering ammunition, and preparing to confront the most powerful military force in the world. They could not have known that their actions on the following morning would set in motion events that would culminate in American independence and the creation of a new form of government that would inspire democratic movements across the globe. The first pale light of dawn on April 19, 1775, revealed a scene that would become etched in American memory forever. On Lexington Green, a small triangular piece of common land at the heart of the village, approximately 70 colonial militiamen had assembled under the command of Captain John Parker. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen who had answered the call to defend their community and their rights as Englishmen. Many of them were still pulling on their coats and checking their powder horns. As the British column appeared on the horizon, Captain Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, understood the gravity of the situation facing his small band of militia. The approaching British force outnumbered his men by more than 10 to 1, and they were regular troops with superior training and equipment. Parker's men were armed with a motley collection of hunting rifles, fowling pieces, and ancient muskets, many of which had seen service in previous conflicts. Yet despite their disadvantage, they stood their ground on the green, embodying the spirit of resistance that had been growing throughout the American colonies. As the British advance guard, led by Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, approached Lexington Green, the tension became palpable. Pitcairn, an experienced officer who had served in various colonial postings, recognized the potentially explosive nature of the confrontation. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, he called out to the assembled militia demanding that they lay down their arms and disperse. The exact words spoken in those crucial moments have been debated by historians, but the intent was clear. The British wanted to avoid bloodshed while asserting their authority. Captain Parker, faced with overwhelming odds and recognizing the futility of resistance against such a superior force, reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." This statement, whether spoken exactly as recorded or not, captured the essence of the colonial position. They would not initiate hostilities, but neither would they submit meekly to British coercion. The militia began to disperse as ordered, but they retained their weapons, a detail that would prove significant in the moments to come. In the confusion and tension of the moment, as British soldiers advanced and colonial militia reluctantly gave ground, a single musket shot rang out across Lexington Green. To this day, historians debate who fired that first shot. The shot heard round the world, as Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call it. Some accounts suggest it came from a British soldier's weapon discharging accidentally. Others claim it was fired by a colonial hiding behind a stone wall. What is certain is that this single shot shattered the morning calm and changed the course of history. The sound of that first musket shot seemed to break a dam of pent-up tension and fear. British soldiers, perhaps startled by the unexpected discharge, began firing without orders from their officers. Major Pitcairn later claimed he tried to stop his men from shooting, but discipline broke down in the chaos of the moment. The colonial militia, caught in the open and vastly outnumbered, could offer little organized resistance. Within minutes, 8 Americans lay dead on Lexington Green, and 10 more were wounded. Only one British soldier was slightly injured in the brief engagement. The British regulars quickly reformed their ranks and continued their march toward Concord, leaving behind them a green stained with blood and a community galvanized by tragedy. The dead included Jonas Parker, Captain Parker's cousin, and Jonathan Harrington, who managed to crawl to his doorstep before dying in his wife's arms. These were not abstract casualties of war, but neighbors, friends, and family members whose deaths would fuel the rage and determination of their surviving countrymen. The Battle of Lexington, though brief and one-sided, had transformed a political dispute into an armed rebellion. The British column, now bearing the weight of blood on their conscience, pressed forward toward Concord with grim determination. By the time they reached the town center around 8 o'clock in the morning, word of the killings at Lexington had spread like wildfire throughout the surrounding countryside. Church bells continued to ring, calling militiamen from neighboring towns to converge on Concord. What had begun as a routine military operation to seize illegal weapons was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous and significant. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, the British commander, deployed his forces methodically upon reaching Concord. He ordered companies to search for the hidden weapons and military supplies that intelligence reports claimed were stored throughout the town. Some British soldiers were sent to secure the North Bridge, which crossed the Concord River about a mile from the town center, while others began systematically searching houses, barns, and other buildings for contraband military materials. The colonials, having been forewarned of the British approach, had successfully hidden or removed most of their weapons, but the soldiers did discover and destroy several cannon, along with some gunpowder and military supplies. Meanwhile, colonial militia companies continued to arrive from surrounding towns, drawn by the alarm system that had functioned with remarkable efficiency throughout the night. Men came from Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, and other nearby communities, swelling the colonial force to nearly 400 by mid-morning. These reinforcements gathered on Punkatasset Hill, overlooking the town and the North Bridge, where they could observe British movements while remaining out of range of British muskets. The sight of smoke rising from the town center, where British soldiers were burning the military supplies they had discovered, convinced many colonials that the regulars were putting their homes to the torch. Major John Buttrick of Concord, along with Colonel James Barrett, took command of the growing colonial force. Unlike the situation at Lexington, where the militia had been surprised and outnumbered, the Americans now held numerical superiority and the advantage of choosing when and where to engage the enemy. The decision to advance toward the North Bridge was not made rashly. It represented a calculated risk based on tactical advantage and growing moral outrage. Over the events of the morning, the colonials moved down from Punkatasset Hill in a calm formation, their determination evident in their steady advance toward the bridge. Captain Walter Lowry, commanding the British detachment at North Bridge, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His force of approximately 100 men was now significantly outnumbered by the approaching colonial militia, and his position on the far side of the bridge from Concord Center meant that he was effectively cut off from the main British force. As the colonials advanced, Laurie made the decision to fall back across the bridge to the Concord side, hoping to maintain his defensive position while keeping his escape route open. The confrontation at North Bridge differed fundamentally from the earlier engagement at Lexington. Here, the colonials advanced with purpose and organization, while the British found themselves in an increasingly desperate defensive situation. As noted in historian Robert Gross's acclaimed work The Minutemen and Their World, the Battle of Concord Bridge represented a turning point where American colonials transitioned from victims of British aggression to active combatants in their own right. When the colonial militia reached the bridge, tension reached a breaking point. The British soldiers, nervous and isolated, opened fire on the approaching Americans. This time, however, the colonials were prepared and returned fire immediately. The exchange was brief, but decisive. 2 British soldiers were killed, and several more were wounded, while the Americans suffered the dead and several wounded. More importantly, the British were forced to retreat, abandoning their position at the bridge and falling back toward the main force in Concord Center. For the first time in the conflict, British regulars had been compelled to retreat by colonial militia, a psychological victory that would resonate far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The British position in Concord had become untenable by noon on April 19th. What had begun as a straightforward military operation had devolved into a nightmare scenario. For Lieutenant Colonel Smith and his command, the successful colonial defense of North Bridge had demonstrated that the militia could stand and fight against regular troops, and reports from scouts indicated that colonial forces were continuing to grow. As more companies arrived from distant towns, Smith made the difficult but necessary decision to begin the retreat to Boston, a march that would prove far more harrowing than the confident advance of the previous night. The British column formed up for the march back to Boston around noon, with wounded soldiers loaded onto requisition carts and the remaining supplies they had discovered, either destroyed or abandoned. Smith deployed light infantry companies as flankers on both sides of the main column, hoping to prevent colonial forces from getting close enough to inflict serious damage. However, the British tactical formations that had proven so effective on European battlefields were poorly suited to the New England landscape of stone walls, thick forests, and rolling hills that provided countless positions for concealment and ambush. Colonial militia companies, now numbering in the hundreds and continuing to grow, had positioned themselves along the route of the British retreat. Unlike the earlier engagements at Lexington and Concord Center, these men were not standing in the open trying to fight a conventional battle. Instead, they employed tactics learned from decades of frontier warfare and conflicts with Native American tribes. They used trees, stone walls, houses, and barns as cover, firing at the British column and then melting away before the regulars could organize an effective response. The retreat quickly became a running battle that stretched across 18 miles of Massachusetts countryside. At Merriam's Corner, just outside Concord, colonial militia opened fire on the British rear guard, inflicting several casualties. The pattern was established. As the British column passed each strategic point, colonial forces would emerge from concealment to deliver devastating volleys before disappearing again into the landscape. The psychological effect on the British soldiers was perhaps even more damaging than the physical casualties, as they found themselves under constant attack from an enemy they could rarely see and never seemed to fully engage. As referenced in historian Alan French's detailed account The Day of Concord and Lexington, the British retreat represented a fundamental shift in the nature of 18th century warfare, as colonial militia abandoned European conventions in favor of tactics better suited to American conditions. The British soldiers, trained to fight in formation against similarly organized enemies, found themselves struggling to adapt to this new form of combat. The situation grew increasingly desperate as the British column approached the town of Lincoln. Here, colonial forces had established strong positions behind stone walls and in wooded areas overlooking the road. The British flankers, exhausted from hours of fighting and marching, were unable to effectively clear these positions before the main column came under fire. Captain Lawrence Parsons, commanding the rear guard, reported later that his men were taking casualties from an invisible enemy. that seemed to materialize from every tree and stone wall. By the time the British reached Lexington on their return journey, their situation had become critical. Ammunition was running low, casualties were mounting, and the soldiers were near exhaustion from the constant stress of being under fire. Many of the wounded could no longer walk, placing additional strain on their comrades who had to help carry them. The colonial militia, meanwhile, continued to receive reinforcements as more companies arrived from towns throughout eastern Massachusetts. What had begun as a simple punitive expedition had become a desperate fighting retreat against overwhelming odds. The transformation of the British force during the retreat was remarkable and disturbing. The confident regulars who had marched out of Boston the previous night had become exhausted. The demoralized column of soldiers fighting simply to survive. Their officers struggled to maintain discipline as men broke ranks to seek cover or to help wounded comrades. The retreat from Concord had become a symbol of British vulnerability and colonial determination that would inspire resistance movements throughout the American colonies. Just as the British situation appeared most desperate, with the exhausted column barely maintaining cohesion in the face of relentless colonial attacks, salvation appeared on the horizon in the form of a relief force, commanded by Brigadier General Hugh Percy, responding to increasingly urgent messages from Lieutenant Colonel Smith, had marched from Boston with approximately 1,000 fresh troops and a 6-pound cannon. The timing of his arrival at Lexington could not have been more crucial, as Smith's original force was on the verge of complete collapse. General Percy had not undertaken this relief mission without understanding its significance. The son of the Duke of Northumberland and a veteran officer with extensive European service, Percy recognized that the events unfolding in Massachusetts represented far more than a simple riot or civil disturbance. The organized resistance his forces encountered on the march from Boston to Lexington convinced him that the colonial rebellion had reached a level of sophistication and determination that British authorities had failed to appreciate. His relief column had also come under sporadic fire during their advance, though nothing approaching the intensity of attack suffered by Smith's retreating force. The junction of the two British forces at Lexington provided a temporary respite from the colonial attacks. But Percy quickly realized that his enlarged command faced the same fundamental problem that had plagued Smith's retreat. They were surrounded by an increasingly numerous and confident enemy fighting on familiar terrain. The colonial militia, rather than being intimidated by the arrival of British reinforcements, seemed energized by their success against the original expedition. Companies continued to arrive from towns throughout the region, and Percy estimated that he now faced between 1,500 and 2,000 colonial fighters. Percy's tactical situation required immediate decision-making. He could attempt to hold Lexington and wait for additional reinforcements from Boston, but this would mean remaining stationary while colonial forces continued to grow. Alternatively, he could continue the retreat to Boston, gambling that his larger force and fresh troops could fight their way through the colonial gauntlet. Percy chose the latter option, but not before making crucial tactical modifications to British procedures that would prove essential to the survival of his command. Understanding that conventional European military tactics were unsuited to the current situation, Percy deployed his forces in a formation better adapted to colonial fighting methods. He organized strong flank guards to clear colonial positions before the main column came under fire, and he made effective use of his artillery to suppress colonial forces gathered in strong defensive positions. Most importantly, Percy authorized his troops to use colonial buildings as cover and to engage in the same type of irregular fighting that had proven so effective for their opponents. As documented in historian David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Paul Revere's Ride, Percy's tactical adaptations represented a crucial learning moment for British forces in America, demonstrating both the inadequacy of traditional European military doctrine in colonial conditions and the potential for adaptation when commanders remained flexible and observant. The renewed British retreat from Lexington toward Boston became a different type of engagement than the morning's desperate flight from Concord. While colonial attacks continued, Percy's larger force and improved tactics allowed the British to maintain better order and inflict heavier casualties on their tormentors. The two 6-pound cannon proved particularly effective in clearing colonial positions, as the militia had no artillery of their own and were forced to abandon positions when subjected to cannon fire. However, the fundamental strategic situation remained unchanged. The British were still retreating under fire through hostile territory, and colonial reinforcements continued to arrive faster than British casualties could reduce the opposing force. Towns that had contributed single companies in the morning were now sending multiple units, and some communities that had been too distant to participate in early fighting were beginning to arrive on the battlefield. The retreat had become a test of endurance and will as much as military skill. The British retreat continued through this afternoon of April 19th, with General Percy's enlarged force fighting a running battle against colonial militia that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. As the column moved through the towns of Arlington and Cambridge, the character of the engagement evolved once again. The colonial forces, emboldened by their success and growing in both numbers and confidence, began to adopt increasingly aggressive tactics that transformed the retreat into one of the bloodiest days in the pre-revolutionary conflict. The town of Arlington, known then as Monotony, became the scene of some of the most intense fighting of the entire day. Here, the colonial militia had established strong positions in houses and behind stone walls that commanded excellent fields of fire over the British line of march. Unlike the earlier hit-and-run tactics employed around Concord, the militia in Arlington stood and fought, engaging in sustained firefights with British regulars. The result was heavy casualties on both sides, with the British suffering their highest losses of the day as they fought to clear the town house by house. Percy's tactical innovations proved crucial in the fighting at Arlington. His use of flanking companies to clear colonial positions before the main column advanced prevented the complete devastation that might have resulted from marching directly into prepared ambush positions. However, the cost of these tactics was significant, as the flankers suffered heavy casualties in their close quarters fighting with colonial militia, who knew every building and back alley in their home communities. The British artillery continued to be effective, but the urban environment limited the cannons' field of fire and reduced their tactical impact. The colonial militia fighting in Arlington included not only local men, but also companies that had marched from considerable distances to join the battle. Men from towns 20 and 30 miles away had covered impressive distances in response to the alarm, demonstrating the effectiveness of the colonial communication network and the depth of anti-British sentiment throughout the region. Many of these reinforcements arrived tired from their long marches, but eager to strike a blow against British authority. One of the most significant aspects of the fighting at Arlington was the participation of civilian non-combatants who had initially been mere observers of the military action, as British soldiers began breaking into houses to clear potential sniper positions. Some residents took up arms to defend their property and families. This expansion of the conflict beyond military participants would have profound implications for how both sides viewed the nature of the struggle and the rules of engagement that should apply. The psychological impact on British soldiers of fighting in a populated area where the distinction between combatants and civilians had become blurred was severe. Soldiers reported feeling that every window might conceal an enemy musket and every closed door might hide an armed opponent. The stress of urban combat, combined with the exhaustion from hours of fighting and marching, began to tell on British discipline and morale. Reports from the retreat describe incidents of British soldiers breaking into houses, not to clear military positions, but to search for alcohol or to vent their frustration on colonial property. As noted in historian Arthur Tortellet's comprehensive account Lexington and Concord, the fighting at Arlington represented an escalation in the intensity and personal nature of the conflict that would characterize much of the subsequent Revolutionary War. General Percy himself later wrote that the colonial resistance exceeded anything he had experienced in European warfare, both in its intensity and in the universal participation of the local population. By the time the British column fought its way through Arlington and approached Cambridge, it was clear that the day's events had transformed the nature of the conflict between Britain and her American colonies. What had begun as a limited military operation to seize weapons had become a general uprising, involving thousands of colonial militia and affecting dozens of communities across eastern Massachusetts. The British retreat had become a symbol of colonial resistance that would inspire similar actions throughout the 13 colonies. The approaching darkness of evening provided some relief to the exhausted British forces, as colonial attacks decreased in intensity when visibility declined. However, Percy understood that his command remained in grave danger as long as they were in hostile terror. Why? The final push to reach British lines at Charlestown would require every remaining reserve of strength. then disciplined his men could muster as the sun set on April 19, 1775. General Percy's battered column finally reached the safety of British naval guns at Charlestown, ending one of the most significant military engagements in American colonial history. The British forces had suffered 273 casualties, including 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. Colonial losses were significantly lighter, with fewer than 100 casualties total, but the disparity in numbers told only part of the story of this transformative day. The immediate aftermath of the battles revealed the profound impact these engagements would have on the relationship between Britain and her American colonies. News of the fighting spread rapidly throughout the colonies via the same communication networks that had mobilized the militia on April 19th. Within days, accounts of British atrocities at Lexington and the successful colonial resistance at Concord Bridge were being read in taverns and churches from Georgia to New Hampshire. The narrative that emerged portrayed the British as aggressors who had fired upon peaceful colonists, while the militia were cast as defenders of liberty and constitutional rights. The British perspective on the day's events differed markedly from colonial accounts, but even British officers recognized that something fundamental had changed in the imperial relationship. General Gage's report to London described the colonial resistance as far more organized and effective than anyone in the British government had anticipated. The militia had demonstrated tactical sophistication, strategic coordination, and a level of commitment that suggested the conflict would not be resolved through limited military action. Percy himself wrote that the rebels are not the despicable rabble too many have supposed them to be. The political ramifications of Lexington and Concord extended far beyond Massachusetts. When news of the battles reached the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, delegates who had previously favored reconciliation with Britain found their positions increasingly difficult to maintain. The shedding of blood had created a momentum toward more radical positions, and moderate voices calling for compromise were overwhelmed by demands for military preparation and organized resistance. Within weeks of the battles, Congress authorized the raising of a Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commanding general. International implications of the battles became apparent as news reached European capitals. British credibility as a global power was damaged by reports that colonial militia had forced regular troops to retreat, while potential enemies of Britain began to see opportunity in American colonial resistance. The French, still smarting from their defeat in the 7 Years' War, began quietly exploring ways to support American rebellion against their traditional enemy. The battles of Lexington and Concord thus became the opening chapter of what would eventually become a global conflict involving major European powers. The transformation of the colonial militia during the fighting also had profound implications for American military development. The success of irregular tactics against European-trained regulars validated approaches to warfare that would characterize American military thinking for generations. The concept of citizen soldiers who could be rapidly mobilized to defend their communities became embedded in American military culture and would influence debates about standing armies versus militia forces throughout the early national period. Perhaps most significantly, the events of April 19th established a powerful narrative of American resistance to tyranny that would become central to the developing American identity. The image of farmers and shopkeepers standing up to professional soldiers, of communities uniting to defend their rights, and of ordinary citizens making extraordinary sacrifices for liberty became foundational myths of the American Revolution. These stories, whether entirely accurate in all details or not, provided the ideological framework within which Americans understood their struggle for independence. The battles of Lexington and Concord changed the course of American history because they transformed a political dispute into an armed rebellion, demonstrated that colonial resistance could be effective against British military power, and created a narrative of American heroism and British oppression that would sustain the revolutionary movement through 8 years of war. The shot heard round the world that rang out on Lexington Green that April morning echoed not only across the American colonies, but around the globe, inspiring democratic movements and challenges to monarchical authority that continue to influence world history today. What began as a British attempt to seize colonial weapons became the opening battle of a revolution that would create a new nation and a new form of government based on the consent of the governed.